Beyond praise, awards, player numbers and sales, the mark of what can be considered a truly successful game is its memorability. Its ability to draw you in and engross you in an experience that is quite literally unforgettable. Virtually every game in existence has sought to satisfy this elusive piece of the puzzle that, when completed, makes for a truly great gaming experience. Through narrative progression, striking visuals, innovative gameplay elements, or even just sheer addictiveness, many a developer the world over wants their creation to transcend the digital realm and keep playing in your mind long after you've shut it down. Out of the countless number of games you've played throughout your life, how many of them do you really remember? How many have left you with a tinge of sadness on completion, with the realization you can never have that magical first playthrough experience again? It's a gold standard of quality that only the best games can boast. Moments like the first meeting with Sovereign in Mass Effect, saying goodbye to Lee in The Walking Dead, or witnessing Arthas' downfall in Warcraft 3 are just a few examples of a game doing such an excellent job of pulling you in that you still feel attached to it after you leave. Achieving such a feat requires more than a few core elements to be executed perfectly. The usual boxes need to be ticked: characters, sound, art style, mechanics. But perhaps the most crucial element, atmosphere, is notoriously difficult to conjure effectively. When done successfully, however, a captivating atmosphere is often greater than the sum of its aforementioned parts, and can evoke complete immersion, even so that you could even overlook any possible shortcomings. And in my opinion, there's no game that embodies this statement more than Metro 2033. A title with a background that's nearly as interesting as the game itself, the Metro series has gone from an obscure online experiment to a video game phenomenon, giving a unique perspective on the first-person shooter genre as we know it. And with a new entry in the beloved video game series poised to engulf players yet again in the very near future, I think it's a perfect time to look back at the modern classic that started it all. This is the unique story of Metro 2033. While the post-apocalyptic premise has, at this point, been recycled and regurgitated to excess with an innumerable number of films, books, games and TV shows based on or around it, 17 years ago in 2002, it wasn't quite as prevalent in pop culture. And it's around this time when a young Russian author named Dmitry Glukhovsky released the beginnings of his entry into the still maturing genre, and introduced people to the world of Metro 2033. His unique novel follows Artyom, a young Russian man who lives in the underground train stations in Moscow following a catastrophic nuclear war that's left most of Earth's surface an uninhabitable wasteland, a place where only mutated creatures and dilapidated remains of the old world remain. Following its online-only release and eventual print edition, Metro 2033 went on to become the popular first-person shooter that most people know it by today. At the time of the game's release in early 2010, it proved to be a welcome breath of fresh air, presenting a unique take on a genre that, at the time, was beginning to stagnate. Because of Metro's distinctly Russian setting, its being written by a Russian author, and its development into a video game by a team in Ukraine, the perspective it offered was something most Western gamers had not had a chance to experience. Save for a couple of titles such as the previously released Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, and Cryostasis. While the novel does an admirable job in painting a vivid picture of the Metro's dark tunnels and the nuclear wasteland above, horrifying monsters and mutants and the grim realities of humanity's bleak underground existence, there's nothing quite like experiencing it in a more visceral, fully realised 3D environment. Hearing the shrieks of beasts in the unending darkness, or spotting something out of the corner of your eye, only to look and see nothing there at all. Playing as Artyom rather than vicariously following him through the words of a novel certainly elevates your perception and interpretation of the fantasy world to a whole other level of immersion. The team at 4A Games did an amazing job in translating Glukhovsky's work into the interactive medium that it is today, and due to its success it catapulted the then fledgling Metro series into worldwide fame as one of the best examples of a dark and grim post-apocalyptic world. But to truly appreciate where it is now, you should know the history behind it, the struggles, the failures, and the successes. And for that, we need to take a trip back to where it all began. Our story begins in 2002, when a 23-year-old Glukhovsky who was living in France at the time released the beginnings of his new novel, Metro 2033, online, for free. Anyone could read his work, providing you could read Russian of course, and it proved to be immediately popular, not just because it was free, but because it was good. Really good. Glukhovsky was a smart guy. He'd just spent 4.5 years earning a university degree in journalism and international relations in Israel, and he could speak at least 3 languages. His grasp on language, both written and spoken, was incredibly strong, and it undoubtedly helped him in writing 2033 to the level of quality that it is. Thousands of people went online to read it, and they would take part in what Glukhovsky later called an interactive experiment, where he would write and release new chapters online to get feedback from the readers, which he would then incorporate into new sections of the novel, and this continued into its eventual completion in 2004. Reading the book today, the method in which it was written can be noticed if you're looking out for it, as the chapters can often feel like their own individual sections instead of one singular story like most books. Glukhovsky has said that when he was writing it, he really had no idea how the story was going to evolve, and he was discovering this world chapter by chapter just as much as the main character Artyom was. And by the time 2006 rolled around, the Metro 2033 novel had been printed in Russia and sold over 100,000 copies within just 3 months of being published. It's around that same time where the title's popularity caught the eye of 4A Games, a newly formed developer based in Ukraine. Glukhovsky was a gamer himself, being a fan of the Civilization series since he was a child, and before he had begun discussions with 4A, he had actually been contacted by multiple developers looking to translate his novel into a video game. However, none of them had been able to convince him. He knew whoever took on the project would need to know what they were doing and be able to effectively convey the intense themes and atmosphere of the Metro. And in 4A, he finally found a developer that he knew could pull it off. 4A Games was founded by 4 former employees of GSC Game World, who were at the time developing Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl. Having experience working on Stalker as well as GSC's X-Ray game engine, they used their expertise to develop the new 4A engine, a completely in-house and proprietary software set that would be used to create Metro 2033. This meant 4A had complete control over all aspects of the game while it was in development, giving them the ability to tailor everything to exactly how they and Glukhovsky wanted it. It was the perfect pairing to give the novel the attention to detail it both deserved and needed in order to be successfully translated into the video game format. The project had officially begun development in 2006, and in August of that same year it was announced to the public at the Leipzig Game Convention as Metro 2033, The Last Refuge. For those watching who have played the release version, some of what you're seeing in this initial pre-alpha trailer may look familiar. Honestly, the level of visual fidelity here for 2006 is pretty impressive, and from the looks of this footage one could assume at the time that the game was well on its way to being completed. But despite that, hardly anything new would be heard about the game's ongoing development until nearly 2 years later, with some interviews with 4A staff talking about the game's mechanics and points of difference. It says a lot when reading these interviews that the reference photos used for the game still have watermarks saying copyright 4A Games 2006. Interestingly, the end of 2008 also saw a new pre-alpha trailer, but it showcased nearly the exact same footage from 2 years before. Initial inspection of the trailer shows it's nearly shot for shot the same as the one from 2006, along with still carrying the title Metro 2033, The Last Refuge. Look closer though and you'll see that there are some major differences, such as the addition of a lot more civilians and general liveliness into the Metro, as well as some fancy first-person shots and swooping camera movements. And while it doesn't seem like a lot of progress had been made in this time, it's most likely that there was a lot of work being done behind the scenes. Don't forget that 4A was developing their new engine alongside 2033, something that was sure to slow down their progress. And so another year passed, but in October of 2009, members of the gaming press received an interesting letter in the mail, signalling that their wait to journey into the darkness below Moscow was finally nearing its end. Following a re-announcement via 4A Games publisher THQ, shiny new footage of the game was released, showing the major leaps that had been made in both fidelity and quality by 4A. The game was looking ready for prime time, and over the next few months leading up to its launch, more and more information was becoming available. Interviews with both the developers and Glukhovsky himself, trailers, articles, the whole 9 yards. People were excited, and they had good reason to be. The game was being described as an atmospheric, story-driven shooter. You know what that sounds like? Yeah, you do. So, after being known by the public for nearly 4 years at that point, could the game live up to the expectations that had been set for it? Well, in March of 2010, people were ready and able to descend into the depths of the metro and find out for themselves. As soon as you begin your journey into Metro 2033, you're plunged straight into a truly bleak and shadowy world. Even from the starting menu, your feeling of immersion is one of Metro's strongest points, and it never falters throughout your entire experience. Whether you're travelling through the Metro's tunnels or venturing above to the surface, this world and the people inhabiting it feel believable, perhaps more than any other game I've played before. 2033's original overarching story has remained relatively unchanged with its transition. Most of the differences come from the shortening and cutting of portions from the book in order to more streamline the game's main narrative. While book readers may notice some missing characters, sequences, and other wee details, Artyom's mission to travel to the central metro station Polis and warn them about the imminent threat of the Dark Ones remains. The obvious difficulty with turning the Metro 2033 novel into a game is that, contrary to the book, the main character Artyom is a silent protagonist. While the reasoning for this makes sense, as the player is Artyom and having him speak would somewhat take away control from you, you can see the challenge in translating a character that in the books has a persistent internal monologue and often talks with others. But in spite of that, I think 4A did a great job considering the situation. Even though Artyom acts as your window into this world, there's still enough character and backstory given to him to make him feel like a real person. There is the nice touch of having Artyom speak while in loading screens though, where he gives his internal thoughts on the current situation and a bit of context on the upcoming mission. Another twist with the story is that while in the novel there's obviously just one clear ending, 4A wanted to have more than one outcome to the game. Now for those of you who have played 2033, you might be thinking, there's more than one ending? And that would be fair, considering it's actually not that obvious if you've just played the game, saw the ending, and then moved on. How the game decides on which ending you receive is calculated through a hidden morale point system. It looks through decisions you make throughout the entire game, both big and small. While some are more obvious, like should you take ammo from the civilian who's offering it to you even though she probably needs it, a lot aren't actually choices at all. It's more of a do this and get a point or do this and lose a point kind of system. As an example, here's two situations from the start of the game. If you play the guitar in your room, it gains you a morale point. And if you take the ammo from next to the man playing guitar in the station, it loses you one. It's a great hidden way to determine the ending, because if the player isn't aware of it, their choices won't be influenced by wanting to get the good ending. And while one of them obviously had to be picked as the quote-unquote real ending when going into the game's sequels, where the Dark Ones were destroyed rather than saved, it's great to see these kinds of subtle mechanics used in a way that the player may not even realise that they exist. But it's not just the story and setting that props up the feeling of immersion. The game's mechanics do an excellent job in engulfing you, and they do everything they can to make you forget you're inhabiting a virtual world. What's impressive is that 4A have translated a lot of elements from the book in a way which things don't feel gamified, a trap that a less competent developer could easily have fallen into. A great example of this is the use of a personal journal which displays your current objective, instead of just having it appear through an out-of-world menu like in most games. You physically need to hold it out to see your current goals, and if it's dark, you're going to have to flick your lighter on in order to actually read what's on it. Same goes for your watch, which displays how long an equipped gas mask has until a new filter is required, and also what your current level of detection is when trying to sneak past enemies. It's features like these that really demonstrate the deep level of immersion that 4A was aiming for, and you can tell there was a lot of thought and effort put into even the smallest details in order to achieve this. However, Metro 2033 is still a first-person shooter, and the core gameplay loop needs to be enjoyable in order to make these decisions feel justified. And luckily, the shooting in 2033 is thoroughly exciting. The game features multiple guns, some being from before the war and some that were scratch-built inside the Metro, clunky contraptions that may be inaccurate or just plain ineffective. The game also features variants of most guns which can have attachments like scopes or silencers to give more options when dealing with situations. There's a strong arsenal of secondary weapons too, like grenades and throwing knives to bolster your offensive potential. Unfortunately, not all of the game's combat is perfect. The stealth sections in particular can be frustrating, with things like whole squads of enemies knowing instantly where you are if you just make one little noise, and limited resources often forcing you to take the route of trying to shoot through everyone in the level since I've run out of throwing knives. There's also some specific moments that can be incredibly irritating, like a turret section that's extremely unforgiving on higher difficulties, or just finding your way through a multi-leveled building full of monsters when you completely run out of ammo. However, you could almost say that these are difficulties because of the player not managing their resources well enough, especially on higher difficulties and if you're playing on Ranger mode when the HUD is dialed down and things are a lot tougher. While the game obviously gives you a certain amount of ammo and other items to assist you throughout, the management of these items is completely left in your hands. If you burn through all your ammo by shooting wildly and inaccurately, you might not find more for a while, and it will leave you in a tough spot if you have to deal with a less than friendly monster. Now you can buy all the necessities at dealers throughout the game, but these opportunities are scarce, so you shouldn't rely on one always being around the corner. So, if you're making a trip up to the surface, it's up to you to make sure you have everything you need. Bullets for your guns, medkits, enough filters for your gas mask, etc. And if you run out of any of those things in a mission, you might have to rethink your strategy. An interesting wrench thrown into all that is that in the world of Metro 2033, the currency is military grade ammunition, which can be found throughout the world and gained by selling things to merchants. So you can choose whether to save these cartridges to buy things, or alternatively load them into your rifle. They'll prove far more effective than the cheap and nasty Metro made ammo, but is it worth it? The game's requirement of resource management persists throughout the entire experience, and while on lower difficulties it's more forgiving with frequent drops and less powerful enemies, you'll still need to keep it in the back of your mind. But 2033 isn't all about shooting things. In fact, a lot of the time the combat takes a back seat in favour of exploration and story development. There are long portions where you'll just be walking, talking, and just taking it all in, and it's in these moments where the game really shines. Walking down dark tunnels, hearing sounds in the distance, not knowing what's going to be around the corner, this is when you're fully immersed, and in my opinion it's where the game's heritage is at its most apparent. A big change from the book to the game is that the game focuses a lot more on action, and it has to make sure it stays exciting and engaging throughout its runtime. For those who have read the book, you'll know that Artyom isn't as much of a trigger-happy soldier as he's portrayed here in the game. In fact, he only kills one person throughout its entirety. Now, while I wouldn't describe 2033 as a horror game, it sure can be frightening and extremely unsettling at times. 4A did an amazing job in translating the book's subtler elements of fear and uncertainty into the game. Take this scene for example. It leaves you with such a great feeling of anxiety and doubt, and scenes like this make the atmosphere throughout the game so thick you could cut it with a knife. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the game's soundtrack and audio effects, which both do an excellent job in helping create the feeling of immersion throughout the entire game. While the music can often take a backseat to everything else, when it's used well, whether that's in a tense chase sequence or frantic combat encounter. But more effective are the effects from monsters and the world itself. Walking through tunnels you can hear wisps of wind travelling throughout the metro, and the crunch of dirt and glass under your boots, which can all be broken in an instant as a mutated creature howls and bounds out at you from the darkness. You'll fire your gun wildly, attempting to down the beast, with nothing filling your ears except the sound of exploding gunpowder and shrieks of pain. And then, just as fast as it happened, it ends. Silence fills the tunnel once again as you continue down the path, keeping your head on a swivel as you wait for the next clash that may or may not be just around the corner. So, despite some negatives like the game's stealth mechanics and a few irritating moments, 2033's overall experience is one that deserves to be remembered and held as a prime example of a game that excels through storytelling and world building, not by giving dopamine hits every 3 seconds that will eventually drive you into madness. And because of its success, Metro 2033 would be the launchpad for more projects set in the universe by 4A, as well as allowing a modern reimagining of itself to be brought to the market just a few years later. Following Metro 2033's success, a sequel would begin production soon after 4A's first title had shipped. Released in mid-2013 as Metro Last Light, it again proved that 4A knew what they were doing and they weren't just a one-hit wonder developer. And while the story wasn't based on Glukhovsky's work like 2033 was, his collaboration with 4A continued as he helped to outline the story and plot for the new title. Last Light updated the mechanics and gameplay from its predecessor and offered an experience that was just as atmospheric and enjoyable as 2033, if maybe a bit more forgiving. Complaints levelled at 2033 like its stealth mechanics were addressed, and overall Last Light was just more polished of an experience in comparison, which is impressive considering the hardships the developers had to go through along the way. In 2012, 4A Games' original publisher THQ filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and it resulted with the publishing rights for the Metro series being picked up by Deep Silver in early 2013. And while this undoubtedly caused some internal issues, it was 4A's working conditions that were likely to be their biggest problem. In a 2013 interview with ex-THQ executive Jason Rubin, he talked about how 4A persisted through a comparatively tiny budget when compared to other big FPS games. They also allegedly had to deal with frequent power outages, old cramped offices, and malfunctioning heating that led to freezing temperatures. Even just one of these could be enough to negatively affect your work, let alone all of them. But 4A stuck through it and turned out a game that received higher ratings and scores than games released at the same time, with massive budgets and far better working conditions. And it wasn't even just that. As they were based in Ukraine, they faced other obstacles, like struggling to get high-end PCs and dev kits into the office as they would need to be brought back from the United States, and subsequently through some less than law-abiding customs officials. And while these were mostly described as going on while Last Light was being developed, it could be assumed that they were the same, or worse, for 2033, which makes what 4A pulled off in their first game even more impressive. It's fair to say that they probably had it worse than most, but they pressed on, and lucky for them, eventually moved their headquarters to Malta in 2014. And that's not all that happened that year. On August 26th, over 4 years since Metro 2033 had been released, 4A released Metro Redux, a repackaged and updated version of both 2033 and Last Light, made for PCs and next generation consoles. While Last Light Redux was more of a Game of the Year edition with all-included DLC and some minor changes, 2033 Redux was something different entirely. Essentially, it was Metro 2033 remade with the graphics, mechanics and changes brought in with Last Light. And today, it's the definitive way to experience that game. While the original version of 2033 was certainly not a bad looking game by any stretch, 2033 Redux brings it in line with Last Light, enhancing the already excellent atmosphere and spectacle that made it so fantastic in the first place. Also welcome were the gameplay and mechanical changes, such as the updated stealth mechanics where enemies were a lot more forgiving when it came to noticing the player, and the revamped weapon modification system where, like Last Light, players can now add and remove attachments to guns instead of having to buy them pre-modified. These changes, as well as a multitude of smaller quality of life ones like being able to wipe blood and rain off your gas mask, helped to make a great game even better. The new version is great for new players to the series as it essentially erases the transition between 2033 and Last Light and makes them feel like one continuous game. It also made it so both games could now be played on next-gen consoles, at the time being the Xbox One and PlayStation 4. It was also awesome for Metro veterans, as it gave them a reason to go back and experience the horrors of the Metro over and over again, and with a fresh coat of paint to boot. Metro 2033 was a game that immersed players in a way that not many games could. More than that, it was fun, a journey that was entertaining and intriguing from start to finish. It also brought 4A games into the limelight, and 2033's success allowed them to further develop and cement themselves as a top-end player in the first-person shooter genre. As for the game series, the acclaim of 2033 led to multiple sequels and remasters, with the third game being released just a few days from this video being published. It's also brought a whole new group of people who are not just interested, but eager to read Glukhovsky's novels, who likely wouldn't even know they existed if the game had never been brought to market. It's obvious that Metro 2033, the game, wasn't meant to be a direct copy of Metro 2033, the book. It's meant as a reinterpretation of the story, made for an entirely new medium and an audience with different expectations. I think this quote from Glukhovsky himself during a Reddit AMA in 2016 describes it perfectly. Games, films, and books are all different arts. You can't simply turn a book into a film or a game, because games and films play by their own rules. There's always a translation required, a translation to a new medium. 4A Games, who created the Metro games, did an amazing job translating my books into games. They treated their original content with much love and respect, and we coincide in our perception of what a decent apocalypse should look like. I didn't expect Metro games to be a sentence-by-sentence repetition of the novels. I wanted guys to create an independent masterpiece based on my stories. And they did. Thanks for watching everyone, see you next time.